This video is going to go through and explain and work out all of the problems that you have on your test review for the upcoming Unit 1B test. So you want to make sure that you are checking your answers and figuring out where your mistakes were and what the correct reasoning behind the explanation is. For number one, you are going to simplify the expression, and that is using order of operations. So we have two sets of grouping symbols, actually three if you want to get technical. We have brackets, we have parentheses, and we have the square root symbol. All three of those are grouping symbols. So we have to start on the innermost one, which would be parentheses for us. 54 divided by 9 is 6, so that turns into 6. So now you have two brackets, 4 squared plus 6 minus square root of 36. And your brackets. So you still have the grouping symbol of brackets, and inside the brackets you have the grouping symbol of the square root sign. So we have to do that next. So we have two brackets, 4 squared plus 6 minus square root of 36 is 6, and then close your brackets. We still have brackets, but the next thing we do inside of them is the exponents. So 4 squared is going to be 16. So still inside our bracket we have 16 plus 6 minus 6. And now inside of our brackets, we only have adding and subtracting, so we want to go from left to right. 16 plus 6 is going to give us 22, and then we're going to subtract 6 next. 22 minus 6 is going to give us 16. And then the last thing we want to do is 2 times 16, and that will give us our final answer of 32. Okay, so you want to make sure you're going through order of operations every step of the way and show your work every step of the way. Right, for number two, we want to say which operation should be performed second in order to simplify. So we're not looking for an answer, we're looking for what operation do we do after the first one. So if you look at the problem, there are no grouping symbols. There is an exponent, so this guy would be first. So you don't want to choose that option. Okay, so after exponents, if you look at what's left, you have divide, add, and multiply. Well, because dividing and multiplying are in the same problem, we have to go left to right. So the second operation we would be doing would be the division. So the answer would then be D. Okay. For number three, again, it's back to evaluating an order of operations problem. So you're going to show all of your work and come up with an answer to write in the box. Right. In the parentheses, we have an exponent. Anything to the 0 power, remember, is 1. If you're not sure about that, type it in the calculator. Okay, and it'll tell you and confirm that it is 1. So this 5 to the 0 turns into 1. And then we have minus 5 in parentheses divided by 2. We still have to do grouping symbols first, so 1 minus 5 is going to be negative 4. And then we're going to divide by 2. And now we can divide. Negative 4 divided by 2 is going to give us the answer of negative 2. Okay, so just remember that anything to the 0 power is 1. All right, so then we go to number 4. Same thing, we're still evaluating, but this time we have absolute value bars. Those are a grouping symbol as well. You have to do the math inside of them before you can come outside of them. All right, so inside of those absolute value bars, 3 minus 5 is going to make negative 2. The negative sign is still on the outside, and then you're going to bring down plus 4. Okay, now what you cannot do is say that these two negatives are double signs, because you cannot break through the walls of absolute value. They're like brick walls that you can't tear down. You have to do the absolute value first and then put the negative in your answer. Right? So the absolute value of negative 2 is positive 2, but then because there's that negative outside the bars, it turns that 2 into a negative 2. And then we want to bring down plus 4, and now we can do negative 2 plus 4, and that gives us an answer of positive 2. All right, then when we go to number 5, you'll notice you do have choices for this, and you do notice that they are fraction answers, which means from this problem you will end up with a fraction answer. You cannot give us decimals or any other type. Right? You can use decimals to help you get to your calculation, but your final answer must be written as a fraction. All right, so let's go ahead and go through our order of operations and see where we end up. Right? Looking at this, we do have grouping symbol, and that's the parentheses, and it's in a fraction, so we have to get rid of that first. The 2 minus 10 is going to turn into negative 8. Right? So now we want to go and take care of the exponents up there on the top, so we're going to try and condense the top down to one number. This 8 squared is going to turn into 64. So the top now reads 64 minus negative 8 over top of 5, and then plus 28 is tacked on there. Now, looking at your top of the problem, you do have double signs here, so these two minuses turn into a big old plus sign. And so you really have 64 plus 8, and 64 plus 8 is 72 over 5, and then we're going to add the whole number 28 to it. Now at this point you have a couple different options. If you remember how to add with fractions, then you would take and put a 1 underneath your 28, you would find a common denominator, which is 5, and then you would continue to get your problem. If that doesn't work for you, or if you know that fractions are your struggling point, here is another way to still end up with the right answer and get you as close to the right answer as you can get. If you wanted to turn 72 over 5 into a decimal, because that's something that's familiar to you, then you would type in 72 divided by 5, and that should give you 14.4. And then you can add your 28 to it. Now when you do that, you end up getting 42.4. Well, if you notice in your answer choices, okay, 42.4 is not an option, right? But because it had a 42 in front of the decimal, then you can rule out letter B right away. And that at least leaves you a 50-50 chance, which is more than what you would have had otherwise. So now we just have to figure out which fraction is going to be the best one. Is it going to be 2 over 5 or 4 over 10 to get us to the 0.4? They both make 0.4 if you type them in the calculator, so that's not going to help you. What you want to look at is the fact that all fractions need to be reduced. So this is written 42 and 4/10. But C is not the answer because you have to reduce your fractions. 4 and 10 can be divided by 2 to reduce them. So that leaves you with your final answer of 42 still there. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. So 2/5 would be the little fraction. So the final answer to this problem is letter A. Okay, but remember, you don't have to necessarily go through and do everything in fractions unless you're comfortable with it. You can switch to decimals as long as you convert back. And for some of you, that's going to be your safety net. All right, going to number 6, you have 5 different problems sitting in this one. You want to circle only the ones that have a negative answer. Right? If it has a positive answer, we're not going to circle it. So we do have to work out all 5 of them to determine which ones are going to be circled. Okay, so if we start with the top one, 8 minus 10 is in absolute value bars, so that's negative 2 in absolute value bars minus 4. The absolute value of negative 2 is positive 2, and 2 minus 4 is the answer of negative 2. So we should be circling this first one. Okay, if we go over to the one right beside it, 6 divided by 2 has to be done first because it's in parentheses, and that's 3. Then we can square it, so 3 squared is 9. And then we can go left to right. 9 plus 7 is 16. 16 minus 1 is 15. That's a positive answer. Do not circle that statement. Okay. Then we go to the one sitting in the middle. Okay. And we have to start with our order of operations there. So parentheses are going to be done first. 1 minus 15 is going to make negative 14 right here in the middle. And then on the bottom, 2 times 3 is going to turn into 6. 2 plus negative 14 is really the same thing as 2 minus 14. So that's negative 12. Over 6, which makes negative 2. We want to circle this one. Our answer was negative. Right? Bottom section, remember anything to the 0 power is the value of 1. So when we go to evaluate this, we have 1 minus 8, then divide by 2. Parentheses, 1 minus 8 is negative 7. Negative 7 divided by 2, right, is going to be negative 7 halves. Right, or negative 3.5, but regardless, the answer comes out negative, so we want to circle this one. Doesn't matter if it's a decimal or a fraction or a negative integer. If it's negative, you have to circle it. All right, then if we go to the last one, 2 plus 5 is going to be 7 in those absolute value bars, but remember there's a negative outside of it, and then bring down minus 7. Right, so the absolute value of 7 is 7, but because of that outside negative, it turns to negative 7. Negative 7 minus 7 more is negative 14, so this answer is negative. So the 4 problems that had negative answers are the 4 that are circled. You have to work out every single one of them in order to pick all the right choices. All right, number 7 is around the same thing, but this time we're looking for only the answers that make 1 after you get done simplifying it. All right, so if you look at the first one, this 2 to the 0 power has to be done first because it's an exponent, and that is 1, but you still have a negative 3 out front. So this is negative 3 times 1, and that makes negative 3. That's not going to get circled because we need the answer to be only 1. If you go to square root of 1 and type it in the calculator, it tells you 1. So that one has to be circled. If you go down to the next one, the absolute value, you want to do exponents first. So 5 squared is 25 minus 26 in those bars. 25 minus 26 is negative 1, but it's the absolute value of negative 1, which is positive 1. So that one should be circled. Then when you go over here to this next one, you have 3 to the 4th power and 3 to the 3rd power, right? And if we go ahead and type in and figure out exactly what each one is, then we can show that it's either going to be good for us or bad for us. All right, so 3 to the 4th power is 81, and 3 to the 3rd power is 27. Right? And if you type in 81 divided by 27, you do not get 1. You get 3. Right? So the answer to this one is 3, and we do not want to circle that. Okay? So the only two that should be circled are the ones that you see on the screen. For number 8, we're back to an order of operations problem. So we want to go through PEMDAS on its own and see if we can end up with the correct answer. There's a lot of grouping symbols in this problem that you want to take care of first too. All right, so stay in the brackets, and in the brackets go inside the parentheses, and in the parentheses go to the exponent. 4 squared turns into 16. Then stay in those parentheses, so 16 minus 9 is going to make 7. You have 8 minus 3 times 7, still in brackets, plus the square root of 144. All right, stay inside the brackets and get all of that down to one number first. All right, so inside the brackets, multiplication needs to be done next. So 3 times 7 is going to be 21. And staying inside the brackets and doing the subtraction, 8 minus 21 is going to be negative 13. And then we can come out here and take care of the square root. The square root of 144 is 12. So now we go to do negative 13 plus 12. The final answer is negative 1. So be super careful as you're going through your order of operation problems and make sure that you are doing every step and aren't skipping things, because that's where mistakes tend to happen. All right, for number 9, you have replacement values for A and B, and you want to figure out which one of these 4 statements is going to make the answer of negative 2. Again, you have to try every single answer before you can find the right one. Okay, so looking at letter A, if I substitute in, I've got square root of 64 minus 5 times negative 2. Square root of 64 is 8, minus 5 times negative 2 is negative 10. Double signs turn into a plus, so 8 plus 10 is 18. That is not the answer, negative 2, so you do not choose A. All right, so then you go to B, and you have the square root of 64 plus 5 times negative 2. Again, square root of 64 is A, plus 5 times negative 2 is negative 10. And then a plus and a minus turn into a minus sign. So 8 minus 10 is negative 2. So it looks like B is our answer right now, but let's double check the other two just in case we made a mistake. Right? Always verify by confirming the other ones are not going to work either. So you have the square root of 64 plus negative 2. So that's 8, and the double signs would make it a minus 2. 8 minus 2 is 6. So that's not going to work. So we know C is out, and we can confirm that. And then for D, we have square root of 64 minus 2 times negative 2. So that's going to be 8 minus negative 4. And that, again, turns into a positive, and 8 plus 4 is 12. So that's not going to work. So after working out each one of them, it is definitely confirmed that B is the correct answer. Right? When you get over to problems like number 10, you have a formula. And again, you're just replacing a value with a number that's already given in this problem. So this is the formula to convert Fahrenheit degrees to Celsius degrees. Right? And you may have seen this before in your science classrooms, but this is where it shows up in math, as the actual math component of it. Right? So if you read through it, it tells you that this is what it represents. And we want to know what is the temperature in Celsius if a thermometer is reading 86. So this 86 degrees Fahrenheit is your degrees Fahrenheit in your problem. So that's what you're going to substitute in. So in parentheses, you're going to have 86 minus 32, and then times 5/9, and that will equal your Celsius. All right, so again, order of operations, you have to do parentheses first. 86 minus 32 is going to be 54, and then times 5/9. And then equals our answer. Now with this part, you can do 5 divided by 9, and it does turn into a decimal, but it's probably a little safer to look at it this way. If you have 54 over 1, okay, you can take and make 54, okay, divided by 9, and that's going to give you 6, and then 6 times your 5 is going to give you your answer, right? Or if you wanted to, you could do 54 times 5, get that number, and divide that number by 9. Regardless of how you compute with that fraction, your final answer comes out to be 30 degrees Celsius. Right, going to number 11, again, it's replacement values. Half of your test is going to be order of operations. The other half looks like this. Right, so you've got to get familiar with plugging in these values, and you're going to notice that some of these values are fractions, and we've got to be able to survive them. Right, so looking at number 11, we have 6 minus 4 times 1/2 over 20 minus 2 times 8. Right, because it's a fraction, we want to go ahead and condense the top numerator down to one number and the denominator down to one number. It doesn't matter which level you start on. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get the top done first. Okay, 4 times half. This is easy. Think of it as what's half of 4. And if you're not sure, take 4 and divide it by 2. Right? Or in the calculator, if you know 1/2 is 0.5, you can take and type in 4 times 0.5 for that 1/2, and it will give you the answer as well. So you just have to find out what is going to help you be successful and get through those fraction problems, right? But decimals are not always the way to go with fractions unless they're short decimal answers that you can use. If they're repeating decimals, that is definitely not the way to go. All right, so half of 4, again, we said was 2. So the top is now 6 minus 4. Okay, and we know 6 minus 4 is 2. Now for the bottom, to clear up the bottom, we need to multiply first. So 2 times 8 is 16. That makes 20 minus 16. And 20 minus 16 is 4. Sorry, I did the top wrong. It's not 2 up there. I'm switching my numbers. Half of 4 is 2, so 6 minus 2 is 4. There we go. I had my numbers switched around. All right, so now that we have 4 over 4, 4 divided by 4 is 1. All right, when you go to number 12, we're going to insert fractions and negative numbers, so be super cautious with those negative values because that's where people tend to make mistakes. So we're going to have negative 4 times 1/2 squared minus negative 4. Okay, and it's always a good idea when you insert a negative number for a letter to stick that negative number in parentheses. All right, so we do have to do exponents first, right? And this is 1/2 squared. So if you wanted to do 1 divided by 2 and get 0.5 and then square it, it will tell you that you get 0.25, but 0.25 is the fraction 1/4. Right? When you're going to square fractions, the quickest way to do this without the use of the calculator is square the top number. So 1 times 1 is 1. That's where the 1 on top comes from. And then square the bottom number. So 2 squared. 2 times 2 makes 4 on the bottom. Then you don't need that decimal to help you out. Right? That's just a little shortcut trick you can take along the way. All right, but negative 4 is still in the front. And then these two minuses back here are going to change into plus 4. And then we can clean this up, right? When you go to take 1/4 of negative 4, it's like you're taking negative 4 and dividing it by 4, right? So when you go to take negative 4 and divide it by 4, right, that's going to turn into negative 1, right? So now we have negative 1 plus 4 as our problem. And negative 1 plus 4 gives us the final answer of 3. Okay, so again, make sure you know how to get through those fractions, whether you're a decimal person or whether you can use the fractions. It's preferable that you stick with the fractions, but at this point we're trying to see if you can get us to the right answer, right? And so that needs to be whatever you are comfortable with. For number 13, this is x to the negative 6th power. If you do negative 2 to the 6th power and that's what you write, you will get this wrong every single time. Anytime you insert a negative number into the spot of a variable, it needs to be in parentheses. With those parentheses, you have now changed the value of that answer because the parentheses mean something important. This means that you have negative 2 6 times. And when you do these, negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. So there's another 4, and there's another 4. And now when you multiply 4 times 4 times 4, okay, you get a positive 64 for an answer. If you did not put parentheses in there, you would not get positive 64, okay, and your answer would be wrong. So make sure you use parentheses around those negative numbers. All right, for number 14, we're back to another formula, and it is a geometry formula, which we'll do later in the year, but at this point, it fits in this chapter because you're substituting values in. You don't need to worry about what the letters stand for at this point. It's just a matter of plugging in the values. So we have A equals 1/2. The value of B is 7, and the value of H is 6. Right? So order of operations says we need to either multiply or divide first, so it depends on how you're looking at this. If you're looking at this as 1 divided by 2 times 7 times 6, then you will have to start with 1 divided by 2. All right? If you're looking at it as 0.5, then you just multiply straight across. Right? So 1 divided by 2 is 0.5, then times 7 times 6. Or you can take the way without a calculator. 7 times 6 is 42, and half of 42 is 21. So regardless, you're going to come out with the answer 21. You just have to figure out which way is best for you to understand it. Okay, when you get down to number 15, again, we're substituting negative numbers in, so be careful with your signs. All right, so we have negative 8 times 3 minus, now we want to put parentheses because there's a negative number, -2 to the 4th power, right? We do have to do exponents first. You cannot do double signs. Exponents come before double signs, right? So we need to take care of this piece before we do anything else in the problem. -2 to the 4th power is the same as -2 times -2 times -2 times -2. If you look back above, it's this piece right here, right? And we know that 4 times 4 is 16. So we now have -8 times 3 minus 16. Okay, so the exponents are gone. Then you want to do your multiplication next. So -8 times 3 is -24 minus 16 more. Right? And -24 minus 16 is going to give you a -40 for your answer. Okay. Number 16 has got us replacing some values, and this time we still have a fraction involved, right? So we want to make sure that we can survive this one too. -3 times 6 times 1/3 minus 4 squared. All right, now inside the parentheses, we need to do exponents first. So we have -3 parentheses 6 times 1/3 minus 16. Right? Then in the parentheses, we need to get rid of those fractions. Right? Now you cannot type in 1 divided by 3 and short it to 0.3 because that's not the same thing. It's a repeating decimal, so you can't make a nice easy number to use. What you can look at this is, if you're going to use a calculator, type in 1 divided by 3, let your screen fill up with all those 3's, and then type in times 6, and it will tell you the correct answer. Or you can say that 1/3 just means cutting it into 3 pieces. If I take 6 and cut it into 3 pieces, or 3 parts, I have 2. So 6 divided by 3 is 2. Okay, but if you type in 1 divided by 3 in the calculator, then immediately hit times 6 and hit your equal sign, it will tell you 2. Okay, and then minus 16. And again, we want to do order of operations, so parentheses is next. 2 minus 16 is -14. -14 times -3 is going to give us a positive 42. Okay, so be very careful with those fractions that are repeating decimals, because you cannot use the decimal part of that if that's what your thinking is. All right, now for this last page of the test review, this comes from the Unit 1A test that you have already taken and we have already gone over in class and handed back to you. These were the weakest spots from that test, so we are going to continue to put it on future tests to make sure that you are practicing it and understanding it and hopefully getting better at it. All right, so looking at number 17, your options are the words rational, irrational, or real, nothing else. All right, so we want to ask ourselves, the square root of 3, which category is it? Well, if you type square root of 3 in your calculator, your whole screen fills up with a bunch of numbers, which means that it's a decimal that never ends. All right, so that means that is an irrational number. If you can't find the square root of it pretty quickly, then obviously it's going to be irrational. Then we go to the next question. What subset of the real number system is 2.8? 2.8 is a decimal that stops. Right? And because it's a decimal that stops, it can be made into a fraction, so that would be considered rational. Okay, and yes, both of these are real, but real is not the best name for them. They have better categories to go in. So now the last question is, which subset of the real number system does the product of these two numbers belong, right? Which means if you take in your calculator and type in square root of 3 times 2.8, because that's what product means, is to multiply, you're going to get an answer on your screen. And we want to know, is that answer rational, irrational, or real? And it is going to be irrational. Now, without using the calculator, anytime you multiply or add with an irrational number in your problem, your answer is automatically irrational. So once you see that irrational number pop up in the problem, you don't even have to think twice or even touch the calculator to get the answer right. Okay, so try to remember that as you go through those questions. Number 18, we want to circle all of the irrational numbers. These are the decimals that never stop and have no repeating pattern and cannot be made into a fraction. Right? So if we look at the first one, it has a repeating bar. Right? Repeat and rational both start with the same letter. So that's how you can remember where it's going to go. All right, so obviously if this is repeating, it's rational, it is not going to be circled. All right, pi, we know pi is definitely irrational. That should automatically be circled. 1/9, if it is a fraction, don't even think twice about it. Fractions are automatically rational, so don't touch that one. Square root of 2, if you type it in your calculator, it fills up your whole screen with decimals. Because it made a decimal that filled up your whole screen, the square root of 2 is definitely considered irrational. So then when you go to the next row, you see 2.1313 dot dot dot. Do not be fooled by that dot dot dot. Look to see if that decimal has a repeating pattern. I can tell that 13 and 13 are going to keep repeating. Because it has a repeating pattern, it is going to be rational, so do not circle it. Then when you go to the next decimal, I see 1.8472 dot dot dot. I don't know what the next number is going to be. I can't predict it because there's no repeating pattern to it. This is an irrational number. All right, the next one, 22 over 7. Don't touch your calculator. It's written as a fraction. All fractions are rational. 8/9, same thing. Don't touch the calculator. It's a fraction. It goes to the rational numbers. And then square root of 121 is 11, and 11 is rational. So the only three numbers you should have circled are pi, square root of 2, and 1.8472 dot dot dot. Right, then the last section that we have relates to the properties, right? And this is where we struggled a little bit and got some of them confused, so we thought that we needed to bring those back and keep reminding you of what you're looking for. The best thing to do when you get to the test and are taking this portion is to identify each box first before you even read the questions down below, right? So figure out what properties you're looking at, and then from there you can make a better decision when you're answering the last questions. So for letter A, anything plus 0 equals the thing you started with, that is known as the identity of addition, or additive identity, if you want to say it that way. If you go to letter B, I took a positive 8 and I added a negative 8 to it. This is my inverse of addition, or additive inverse. If I go to letter C, I took ABC, I added nothing to it, I still got ABC. That's identity of addition. Okay, when you end up with the identical answer you started with, because you added 0, you've got identity. Now, if you look at letter D, it's A plus 0, but it says it equals 0. That's not a property. That's nothing. Okay, so don't be fooled by that. Just because you see the plus 0 does not make it automatically identity. You have to look and see if the item that you are adding nothing to is on the other side. So looking at letter E, we have a 9 outside of the A. Notice the 9 is given to the A, and then the 9 to the 4 would make 36. So this is what is known as your distributive property. Looking at letter F, you have the number 7 times 1/7, which equals 1. Anything that involves a fraction and its reciprocal is going to be the inverse of multiplication, or multiplicative inverse. Okay. For letter G, you have some number A and some other number B, and together they make 0. We don't know what A and B are. We don't care what A and B are, but that's not a property. So we just skip over that one. If you go to letter H, you see 15 plus 10 in parentheses, and then it's added to 0, and then you still have 15 plus 10 in parentheses. This is your identity of addition, because you added 0 and you ended up with the same thing you started with. Now that you've taken the time to do that, you can answer the last two questions a whole lot faster, because all you have to do is look at your rectangles and what you wrote underneath them and pick out the right one. So for number 19, it asks us to list all of the letters which describe the multiplicative inverse, so inverse of multiplication. Well, if I look at everything I've written, I only have one box that had inverse of multiplication in it. So there's only one letter that goes there. If you go to number 20, it asks you to list all letters which describe the additive identity, also known as the identity of addition property. So now if you go back up and look at what you've done, I see that letter A is identity of addition. I see that letter C is identity of addition. And I see that letter H is identity of addition. You are more likely to get every single one of those correct if you write underneath the boxes first before you even read the questions, because you're less likely to skip over something. Right? So use this to help you study and prepare for the test. It is just like the test in terms of order and structure. So if you use this to study off of it, then you should be a whole lot more successful on the test than maybe you were on the last one.